Whenever you are.
Okay. You bet the problem.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue on with Chapter 6 here. And we're talking about the structure of plants and how the parts of plants work to grow a crop. So where we left off here, we just gotten through talking about different leaf shapes and the different classifications of plants. So leaf shape is one way that we classify plants. There's all kinds of different leaf shapes and different types of venation out there. One of the ways that we look at identifying new plants, which I think it could be very important for us in the crop growing world out in the fields. Say a new weed comes up, we need to identify what that plant is and determine whether it is actually a weed or if it's possibly a beneficial plant. So how leaves are arranged, as well as how simple or compound they are. So these are all simple leaves because they have one petiole. These here have a petiole that leads to other petioles. So we have compound leaves here at the bottom and multiple leaflets. We started talking about the stem forms and how loss of water throughout the leaf through transpiration is important for the growth of the plant. We talked about the blade and the petiole being part of the leaves and simpler compounds. Right, let me get back to where we were here. Leaving off on flowers here. So flower buds begin through vegetative production, but of course flowers are the part of the sexual part of the plant for sexual reproduction. So angiosperms, the flowering plants, we have all kinds of different plant parts that are involved in the flower. And they're adapted for different reasons. So some of them are for the protection of the flower. Some of them are for just the actual sexual reproduction itself. Some of them are there to attract the pollinators. And remember, that's one of the big things why angiosperms are so successful through the coevolution of the flowering plants with insects. So we have basically plant sexual reproduction occurs as fertilization, the pollen coming from the male part of the flower, fertilizing the female part of the flower, which then develops into some sort of fruit, and stored within the fruit are the seeds. And that is it's different for different angiosperms. For instance, in the grass family, the Poaceae family, you don't really think of it as a fruit so much. You think of it more as a grain. Botanically speaking, it's a caryopsis, as we found with the kernels of corn. So in that case, the whole thing is the fruit, the whole cluster, but each individual seed is what we would kind of consider the grain, along with the chaff that's connected to it. So the flowers and the inflorescences, which are just clusters of flowers, can vary in shape and form, even amongst a species. Different varieties of the species have different shapes and sizes, colors of flowers. And this can help in identifying the plant species, genus, and family. And if we go back to Linnaeus, who categorized all the plants and came up with the system of binomial nomenclature, he was really looking at the sexual parts of the plants and how they reproduce as to why he grouped them together in families. So we look at the flowers as their different morphology. And over here on the right, we have this floral diagram that's kind of looking at the different kind of bundles, the rings in the flower. So one being the calyx, and that is all of the sepals together. So the collective sepals, and the sepal is usually what we find as kind of the green part right below the flower. And you just see here, you can actually see it on this apple here. The sepals are here still attached on the bottom. And that's because of the arrangement of the ovary. The ovary, like in the picture here, is above the sepals. So the sepals, when it develops into the fruit, are still connected. The whorl of petals, which in most flowers is the showy part of the plant, not always though, is referred to as the corolla. The whorl of stamens, the male part of the plant, is referred to as the androecium. And the collective whorl of the carpels, the female part of the plant, the stigma, pistil, and the ovaries are the gynoecium. So below here, we've got the superior ovary where the ovary is arranged above most of the flower parts, half inferior where it's kind of arranged with the flower parts, and then an inferior ovary where the floral parts are actually above the ovary. And that's important in identifying different plant species. And in plant identification, I think it's really important to look at what the class of the plants is, and look at where you are too. So if we're looking at field guides, for instance, as a resource to identify plants, those are usually arranged by geographic region. So like the Audubon Society, for instance, has wildflowers of the eastern region. That covers mostly the native plants. If you're interested in trying to identify weeds, you should be getting a weed book. I'm going to share with you this book here. This is a very large book, as you can see.
You're on screen share. They can't see it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you guys could see my little picture here at the bottom.
No, it's on a different window.
Okay. Well, either way, it's Flora of Virginia, and this book is several thousand pages. Let me just stop the share for a second here. Oh, there you go.
Turn it sideways so my people can see it now. There we go.
Yeah. So this book, Flora of Virginia, this is actually just one dichotomous key, which is kind of like choose your own adventure for plants. And the whole thing with the dichotomous key is basically you're like, it gives you two choices. One, this plant is like this. Two, this plant is like this. Go to the next choice. And so this 1,000 page plus book covers all of the plant life in Virginia, whether it's a native plant or a non-native plant. But you have to really know the botanical terms in order to be able to actually really see that. What I was showing you earlier with the apple, since you guys couldn't see that, is the sepals here connected still at the bottom of the apple, because it has a superior ovary. Get back to the slideshow here. All right, so the floral parts are very important, and because of that, if you're trying to identify a plant, you might not always be able to do that within one season. It might take multiple seasons in order to be able to identify it, because you don't necessarily have the flowers there always. So different morphological terminology here, and how the botanists classify the flowers are by, and these are all for inflorescences other than this solitary flower. The rest of them are clusters of flowers. So whether it's on a spike or a raceme or a panicle, an umbel, these all have different shapes of the flower clusters that we look at for identifying the plant itself. So we also look at whether flowers are complete or incomplete, and perfect or imperfect. So we're looking here at apple and apricot flowers, and these are complete because they have all of the flower parts in one plant, so on one flower even. So we have the male and the female parts both in the same place. And they have the stigma, style, petal. They have all those different flower parts. Incomplete flowers are lacking one or more of those parts, the sepals, petals, stamens, or pistil, those whorls of the flowers. When they have both sexual parts, both male and female, they are perfect flowers. If they only have one, they are imperfect flowers. So those that would have just the male part, the stamens, are staminate flowers, and those with pistils but no stamens are called pistillate flowers. Or you just refer to them as male and female flowers. If we have both pistillate and staminate flowers on different plants, then the species is called dioecious. And that is just, the Latin there is breaking it down into two houses. So that means that there's a male plant and a female plant. And usually in the dioecious plants, there are often the hermaphroditic types as well, where they every once in a while have both. Monoecious plants have both staminate and pistillate flowers on the same plant. So over here we have a walnut flower, and on the left there are the female flowers, and on the right we've got the male flowers. Male flowers, of course, are creating the pollen. Female flowers are receiving the pollen and connecting that to the ovary. So the fruit itself is the matured ovary. So once that pollen grain touches the stigma, which is the receptive part of the female plant, the pistil, it sends this pollen tube up to accept it. And then once that pollen grain reaches the ovules, the individual ovaries, the whole thing begins to swell, and it turns into a fruit. And fruit is there for several reasons. One, it protects the seeds, but it also, in many cases, helps to disperse the seed. And I think of this, you know, plants, their goal in life is to reproduce, to make new plants. And so if you think about it, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? But something picks up the apple and moves it far away from the tree. That's part of the apple's dispersal mechanism. So the apple, we think of that fruit as being a bribe. And in many cases, we're thinking of it as, you know, a mammal or a bird picking up that bribe and moving it far away from the parent. That way it can continue to reproduce without competing with its children. So that's my 2 cents on it anyway. We're talking about how we botanically classify, you know, our plant products. Many of what we consider vegetables, botanically speaking, are actually fruits, because they are, you know, from this process of a matured ovary developing into seeds. So we have tomatoes, peppers, squash, green beans, peas. They are all, botanically speaking, fruits, even though in the dietary world, or sometimes even in the legal world, we consider them vegetables. Apparently there was a court ruling out there that said tomatoes we classify as a vegetable to fit in that area of our diet, but truly they're a fruit because they contain seeds. So anything that contains seed is a fruit. Vegetables would be coming from the vegetative process. Flowers can be self-pollinated, pollinating themselves like the legumes, the beans. I think we mentioned they all pollinate themselves, or they can be cross-pollinated. And cross-pollination occurs by wind or by insects. And the important thing here really is looking at the genetic crossover of plants. So let's just say that you're interested in saving seed from your crops. Beans are really easy to save seed from because they pollinate themselves, and therefore you don't have to worry about them crossing with another bean, usually. When we look at apples, for instance, we have to graft them. We have to basically do this asexual type of propagation because the apple flowers they have a self-incompatibility mechanism. So even though they have the male and female flower on the same plant, they won't accept their own pollen. It has to come from another flower. So a bee picks it up, moves it over, and because of that, it's getting that genetic mixture. So if you took the seed and planted it, you save that seed, sure, you're going to grow an apple tree, but the characteristics are going to be unlike the parents. Another form of cross-pollination by wind, we have that mostly in the grasses and some other plants, but if you think about like corn, for instance, it's producing all of this pollen on the tassels on the top of the plant, and it's using wind as a dispersal mechanism to blow that pollen to the silks, to the female part of the flower, and which then becomes the fruit. So the pollen comes out, forms pollen grains, and then that is then sent to fertilize the egg, which causes the fruit to develop. And then the fruit itself is also used in the botanical classification. And part of that is just looking at the number of carpels that it has. The ovary wall, the kind of interior of the fruit, the exterior of the ovary, is called the pericarp, and it develops into different structures that create different types of fruits. So we have simple fruits that have one ovary formed from one flower. And we look at these simple fruits as either being fleshy, semi-fleshy, or dry, and that's just looking at the actual texture of that pericarp. In the fleshy fruits, that pericarp is developed into some sort of soft, succulent, kind of watery tissue. So a berry, for instance, is a pulpy fruit that has one or more carpels that develop few to many seeds. So bananas, dates, grapes, peppers, tomatoes, and papayas are all examples of berries. And really the big thing here is that that pericarp is connected to some sort of pulpy surrounding the fruit there. We think of it as being kind of more dry in peppers, but it still has that exterior fleshy pericarp. So some things that we think of, I mean, you wouldn't think of it as being classified as a berry, like a tomato, right? But botanically speaking, it's a berry. A Hesperidium is a unique fruit, and mostly they're in the citrus family. They have several carpels, so each of these sections here is a carpel, and it has the inner pulp is in these like juice sacs that are enclosed in some sort of leathery rind. So oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruits, etc., are Hesperidiums, botanically speaking. A pepo is a fruit that is formed from an inferior ovary that develops from multiple carpels, and each of them have many seeds in them. So cucumbers, melons, squashes, they're all pepos. A drupe is a simple fruit that only comes from a single carpel, so it only has a single seed in it. So peaches, plums, cherries, apricots, almonds, and olives are examples of because they have one single seed from one single carpel. And they have that carpel, though, is composed of multiple tissues. We got the exocarp, which becomes the skin of the fruit on the exterior, the fuzzy part of the peach. The mesocarp is the thick, fleshy part. And then the endocarp, we kind of refer to it in these fruits as the stone, is very hard. The pit on the very, or we, is actually what should be considered the pit is the actual seed on the inside of that endocarp. So we might plant that whole stone, but the seed is actually on the very inside of it. A pome is a simple fruit made up of several carpels. So apple, pear, and quince. Dehiscent fruits are fruits that dehisce or split open at maturity to expose the fruits. Legumes, of course, are these pods that form a single carpel which then dehisces along both carpal structures, the seams, to open up and expose the seeds, such as peas and beans in the legume family. Capsules have 2 or more carpels, but each of which produces many seeds. So irises, poppies, good examples of capsules, usually kind of more dry, at least when they're ready and mature. Follicles are fruits that form from a single carpel, and they split along a suture. So delphinium or hellebores are examples of follicles. Silex are 2 carpels with a septum, and they are dry fruits that are separated longitudinally and dehisce that way. So mustard family plants, the brassicas, all have this silex shape. The indehiscent fruits are those that, as you might imagine, do not split open when they are mature. And a achene is a simple one-seeded, thin-walled fruit that is attached to an ovary wall. So achenes are often mistaken for seeds in the case of strawberry fruits, the so-called seeds of the rosehip and the sunflower fruits. So these are actually, they look like seed pods or seeds, but the seed is hidden within the achene. So technically it's still a fruit. We call a strawberry a berry, right? But botanically it's a compound fruit, not actually a berry. Fascinating and somewhat trivial. The caryopsis is as we mentioned earlier, a one-seeded fruit with a thin pericarp surrounding and adhering tightly to the true seed. So all of our grains are caryopsis: corn, rice, wheat, and barley, all members of the grass family. Nuts are one-seeded fruits with a thick, hard, and stony pericarp. So we think of oaks, acorns, chestnuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, hickories are all nuts. Samaras are a one-seeded or two-seeded fruit with a wing-like structure that is formed from the ovary wall. So we think of the samaras as like the helicopter fruit, right? Of the maples, ashes, and elms. A schizocarp is a fruit that is formed when 2 or more carpels at maturity yield 2 one-seeded halves. So carrots, dill, caraway, and parsley, all in the same family. They're all in the Apiaceae, or carrot or parsley family. And note that a lot of these plants, when we look at them, they are fairly closely related. And they're together by these fruits as well as their flowers. So not all of these nuts, for example, are in the oak family, but the oak and the chestnut are, and hickory. The filbert and the walnut are in a different family, but they're still fairly closely related. So we've got the aggregate or multiple fruits that form from several ovaries, where the true fruits are actually attached to or contained with some sort of accessory structure, such as a receptacle. The difference here is that they form from many ovaries on one single flower. So strawberries, for instance, have many achenes that are each attached to a single fleshy receptacle. So those seeds are actually inside that achene that we see on the outside of the strawberry fruit. They're all connected to create this aggregate fruit. Blackberries and raspberries have individual small drupes. So can be a pain eating those fruits, right? You got to floss afterwards because those seeds get in your, stuck in your teeth. Because each of those fleshy coverings is actually technically one individual drupe and contains one seed in it. We also have multiple fruits that develop from many individual ovaries fused together into a single structure that are on one pedestal, one flower stalk. So the fig fruit, for instance, is made up of many small drupes that are then merged together. Pineapple is a large accessory fruit It is covered with basically seedless berries. Interesting. Mulberries are multiple drupelets born on a fleshy receptacle. So all of these, basically how they are fertilized, slightly different, and how those ovaries develop into the fruit makes botanical differences, which we use to classify the plants. On a lot of the weeds, we look at the way that these seeds are dispersed and disseminated. So seeds, of course, are mature ovules, and they vary considerably in their size, shape, and structure. A lot of the plants in the aster family have this pappus type fruit, where the seed, this dry achene here at the base, connected to the flower stalk, is then connected to the pappus, which is this kind of like parachute-like structure that allows it to be dispersed on wind currents. Why dandelions are so invasive in your lawn, right? The samaras, the fruit of the maple, these seeds are contained on this wing-like structure that allows it to float and fly away from its parent as well. Again, trying to think about how these plants, the parent plants, move their children as far away as possible, so that they're not directly competing with them, but yet they're still moving their genetics. All right, last thing here, we got 3 basic parts of a seed. First, we have the embryo, which is basically where all the genetics are formed and where they're stored, which gives the instructions for the new plant to grow. And as we talked about earlier, that embryo has 2 growing points: the radicle, which is that embryonic root that first goes into the soil, and then the plumule, which is the embryonic shoot that arises up out of the ground and then develops into the above ground part of the plant. We have the cotyledons, which we talked about, whether it's a monocot or a dicot. And the cotyledons become a place where food is kind of stored until they can start creating their own leaves. We can also have food being stored in the endosperm or the perisperm, which is in the form of starches, fats, or proteins. And this is important because this is where we get our nutrition from the plants, right? So if you go back to thinking about, our human nutrition, we look at different plant parts, providing different levels of nutrition. And generally the most energy is packed into, and the most nutrition is packed into either the roots of the plant, in the form of like tubers or other storage organs, or into the fruits and seed. So that's where they're storing these starches, fats, proteins, and in some cases sugars as well. So the seeds that have a large portion of their food stored as the endosperm are called albuminous seeds. Then those that don't have an endosperm or a very thin layer surrounding the embryo are called exalbuminous seeds. We also look at seed coats, which are basically there to keep the seeds dormant. And which is very important for us for crops. If we're growing plants from seed, we need those seeds to remain dormant. And the seed coat is partially what does that. We have to remove the seed coat in order to get the seeds to germinate and develop into plants. And we do that through various means. All right, so that's the end of chapter 6 there. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns there? All right, well, I wanted to go over some of the quizzes here and start with a little bit of review. Still have a few people that have not finished chapter 4 and chapter 5 quiz. If you haven't done that, still go in, log in and do it. They should still be available. So we'll go over chapters 1 through 3 today. And I'm going to see if I can take these as a test student.
I've never done that, so I can't help.
Yeah, sorry. I kind of want to show you it and see if we can get the answers shown to us. There were a few things that you guys probably saw on some of the quizzes there where, you know, if the majority of the class got it wrong, then I actually, you know, would change it and give you guys credit for it. And I want to go through those and make sure that we get those correct. All right. Well, it says that as my test student that I'm excused from that. So let's see. I just have to preview it.
Oh, I might have exempted a test student for everything just for consistency's sake when we were writing.
Oh, no worries.
So I wasn't telling you, you got somebody to grade when you really don't. So,
The test student. We're still trying to figure out how to use this Canvas thing properly. So, all right, let me get back in here. Let me log myself out. All right, we'll just preview these quizzes. Sorry, you guys are just not seeing anything here. All right.
There we saying you.
Just seeing me. Here we go. Here's the quiz.
There we go.
All right. So for quiz 1 here, for the majority of time, Homo sapiens has been on planet Earth. They have been conducting some type of agriculture. True or false? That is actually false. So we're talking about the agriculture revolution. A lot of people put that as true. Actually, 99% of the time that Homo sapiens has been on Earth, we were hunters and gatherers. So ended up giving a lot of people fudge points, as they call them, to get around that. So question 2 here, the first agricultural revolution occurred 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. That's true. But did it pretty much happen overnight? No, it did not. It happened probably over actual several thousand years. So that's false as well. In a few sentences, why are Nikolai Vavilov's centers of origin and diversity important to agriculture today? Well, there are actually quite a few reasons. I could go on all day about this, really, but the important concepts of why his centers of origin and diversity are so important. One, because it's where the centers of origin of the plants occur. So it's where they still have their wild plant populations today. And it's still a place where plant breeders go back and look at those wild populations for particular genetic traits, for hardiness, drought tolerance, stuff like that, because that's where they evolved in the wild, and we're able to contend with all these different conditions. If we think about the apple, for instance, its center of origin is actually in what is now modern-day Kazakhstan, to be exact. A lot of the breeders of apples have gone back there to see how we can get some of the unique and novel traits from it, and then go back and try to breed those into modern varieties, developing modern varieties. So it's a store of the genetics of the plants, and could be very important for developing new varieties of plants that are resistant to climate change, for instance. All right, match the style of agriculture with the most accurate responses. This is a question that I messed up on the first quiz. So I think the number of choices didn't always match up. Agronomy, we think of it as being the commodity field crops. Horticulture is more intensive production. Horticulture is high input and high value crops. Agronomy being extensive production. Generally, horticulture are fruits, vegetables, and ornamentals. So I think I gave some fudge points there. The big difference, though, horticulture and agronomy, extensive versus intensive production. Emergy, that term is just embedded energy, not any energy. If yields continually increase across the board and demand remains the same, prices are also likely to increase in accord with the economics of supply and demand. That sounds correct. What do you think, Don?
Yeah.
Yes, supply and demand. It's very important in economics, especially agricultural economics. So if our demand remains the same, prices are likely to increase. You guys pay attention to some of these questions, read them entirely. The quizzes are not timed. So, just try to read all the questions in detail and all the choices too, because I like to get tricky on you. What is a cultivar? A cultivated variety of plants. Match the answers of the scientific method. This is the one I messed up on. So the scientific method, step one here, we're identifying the problem, making a hypothesis. Step two, this is where I messed up. That should have been experimentation there. So I ended up giving you all points for that. Step three would be to check and interpret the results, and step four is to report the results. So that's just the whole scientific method, and to get into how we conduct scientific experiments and how we learn, how plant science and technology is all based on this scientific method, basically. How we make new inventions, right? Question 9 of the following, which is required for a statistically sound experiment? Replication, control, a dependent variable, an independent variable. That should be all of the above. And all of the above should be at the bottom, but learning curve on Canvas. At least a few sentences. Please describe what you think is one of the biggest challenges for agriculture and why. So that's kind of a give me question there, because that's from your own perspective. A lot of people, put overpopulation, definitely a big concern. A lot of people actually put the issue of just economics, the farmer, not making enough money from it. Definitely a big concern as well. I think climate change is one of the biggest challenges for agriculture as well. So lots of different things that we could put there. As long as you answered it in a few sentences, we gave you good full credit for that. All right, let's go to Chapter 2 quiz. And I think I mentioned this as well. Whenever I do these quizzes, just be careful to not. One, try to read the whole thing. Go back and check your answers. They're all given to you at the same time. You got the time ticking over here, but it is not actually time. So just ignore that. You can actually click the hide button, so it's not making you nervous there. Be sure that you answered all the questions too. I had a few people where there just wasn't an answer for some of them. So on quiz 2, we're looking at ecology. Natural ecosystems are usually much less complex than crop ecosystems. That is false. Usually natural ecosystems are more complex than crop ecosystems, because we're talking about all kinds of different species. Even in more advanced cropping systems, in like a polyculture, we generally only have 3 or 4 crops. And a lot of times we're practicing kind of more of a monoculture where there's just one crop per field. So they're less complex. our crop ecosystems are less complex than the natural ecosystem. In agricultural ecosystems, many of the processes and interactions are heavily modified, but they do still exist even in plants being grown indoors. That is true. Even in an indoor potted plant, we still have interactions of bacteria in the soil and fungus in the soil. So even if we're taking them out of their natural ecosystem, we still have ecological interactions. A blank is the position and role that an organism occupies in an ecosystem. That's the niche. These types of questions, where we have fill in the blank, sometimes they might count it wrong automatically if you threw in like an extra space or you misspelled something. But if you got close enough, I'll go back in there and correct it. So again, don't take the score that it gives you at the very end of the quiz as face value. Wait until I grade it for you. Question 4, 2 species cannot occupy the same niche requiring the same limiting resource. One will always outcompete the other, and this is known as competitive exclusion. All right, describe a good weed control strategy that uses ecological principles. The one that we talked about in the lecture was using cover crops as a way to reduce basically the niche, the opening for a weed to come in. There are lots of other things that you could have put there. So if you at least, based it somewhat on and connected it to ecology, then I gave you credit for that. So match each of the following scenario with ecological relationship answer that best fits. So a baby praying mantis consumes aphids. That would be predation. A native vining plant called dodder, Coscuta rostrata, grows around and into the stems of a crop of corn and absorbs its nutrients. That would be parasitism, right? Because it's actually taking those nutrients away from it. Rhizobium bacteria forms nitrogen-fixing nodules on the roots of peas. We refer to that as mutualism because both of them are benefit. The rhizobium is getting a home, a habitat on the root of the pea, and the host plant is getting nitrogen. Moss growing on the trunk of an apple tree is commensalism. One of them benefits, the moss benefits, gets the habitat. The apple tree doesn't really benefit. Mycorrhiza forms a fungal sheath, provides minerals. That's mutualism as well. Largest biome on Earth is the desert. It's kind of scary. So the following is the most productive terrestrial ecosystem. So the key there, which of the following? None of these is the most productive terrestrial ecosystem. So a lot of people put none of the above, and I think I gave you half credit for that, or some fudge points there at the end. The correct answer of which of the following, though, is the temperate forest. It's more productive than both boreal and cropland. Just about all the land that can be cultivated easily is now used for the production of crops. That is true. Finally, plant productivity can be defined by the amount of a harvested portion of a crop. That might be what we refer to as productivity on a business scale, but on the ecological scale, that is false. Plant productivity is the amount of biomass, not just the harvested portion. So let's go to the next quiz here. Chapter 3, that's as far as everybody got. Chapter 4 and 5 are still open, so if you haven't taken it, please do it. Once we go over it, can't give you guys credit for it, of course. So how many calories of energy do we need every day? 2,000 to 3,000, depending on average, right? Some activities you might need more. Hopefully never as much as 60,000, though. When we eat foods, our bodies break proteins down into amino acids, which are then used to build proteins. Which two plant foods are important to be consumed because they provide complementary amino acids. You should get a check for the grains and the legumes. And every agricultural civilization has that grain and legume combination. corn and beans, right? Eating locally produced foods is always better because of lower energy costs. The example we looked at in greenhouse production, there's much higher energy costs, so that's false. Local is not always better, although it is often better. In terms of land use, what will we need to do to be able to provide a varied diet for the world's population? The big thing here is that we would use the arable land, the land that we can grow good plant crops on for growing plant crops. And that land that is not as arable for grazing animals. So by arable, I'm talking about the ability to actually plow it and cultivate it. Yeah, so anyway, that should provide a varied diet for the world's population if we just had the best land reserved for the crops that need it, and the less ideal land more for livestock grazing. And I know some of you cattle grazers would disagree with me there on that one, and that's okay. We could have that conversation. Today, over 80% of chemical food stock comes from plants. That's false. It's all synthesized today. For the mid-1900s, most medicines were derived from plants. That's true. In terms of acreage, largest irrigated crop in the U.S., sad to say, but it is turf grass, lawns, golf courses. Biophilia, that we still love plants. We still crave this connection to nature, so we use ornamentals in our landscape. We bring cut flowers inside. We have house plants. These are how some people express it. Finally, the most labor-intensive crop in the U.S. is ornamentals. All right, so just wanted to go through those quizzes with you. I hope that gives everybody the correct answers there. You should be able to see the correct answers on Canvas as well, but I wanted to at least rationalize some of those correct answers too. So again, if you haven't got on there and done quiz 4 and 5, please do that. And also, please get on there and also sign up for what crop you're going to do your crop project on. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns about any of this, please email me, give me a phone call, and we'll chat it out. All right, we all have a great day, and we'll see you on Monday.
Okay. Did Hunter show up?
Hunter is here.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll be dialing back in a couple minutes.
Thank you.
All right, bye, everybody.